Speaking of the exam, we should have them to hand back to you next Tuesday. I do want to remind you that tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock, we'll be showing The Nasty Girl in the library. If you can't get to see it tomorrow, you might want to try and arrange to rent it. It is easily rentable. Our guest next Tuesday, you're going to have a difficult time understanding her story if you haven't seen The Nasty Girl. And those of you who might need an extra attendance credit, you should try to make it if you can. We will try to hand back your exams in section next lecture after lecture next Tuesday. We've been through some of them, and we'll be finishing up towards the end of the week. We have some guests with us today who are your colleagues in criminal justice, and you can see them. They're all sitting there together for protection, I think. But you're welcome. Thanks for coming. I think you're going to have a very enlightening experience. It is our pleasure to present to you today Dr. James Waller, who is the author of the text that you read, Becoming Evil. How many of you were able to get the second edition at Northlight? Okay. Jim Waller is the Edward B. Lindeman Chair and Professor of Psychology at Whitworth University in Spokane, Washington. He received his B.S. from Asbury College in Kentucky and his M.S. at the University of Colorado, and he has a Ph.D. from the University of Kentucky. His academic specializations include experimental social psychology and the history of psychology and science. He holds memberships in many professional organizations. He's published 35 articles, and for 20 years he's taught courses on intergroup relations, prejudice, and genocide studies. In 1996, Jim Waller developed an innovative study tour titled Prejudice Across America. The tour drew national media attention and was named President Clinton's Initiative on Race as by the Initiative on Race as one of America's promising practices for racial reconciliation. Jim Waller spoke to us last year. The students who were in the lecture series last year rated it among the best lectures of the entire lecture series. I know that you are going to be excited and that you also are going to learn a great deal from Jim Waller. So why don't we all welcome Jim Waller.
Thanks. Can you hear me back okay if I wander out here? Good. It's good to be back here. This has quickly become one of my favorite places to visit, in large part because Dr. Goodman is one of my favorite people in the field of Holocaust studies. So I very much appreciate the chance to be back again with you this year. What I want to do over the next hour or so is really two big pieces. First, I will lay out the problem of genocide in a historical context to give you an idea, especially those of you who may not be in the lecture series on a regular basis, of the enormity of the problem which genocide encompasses, not just in the 20th century, not just today in Darfur, but going back throughout much of human history. And then in the enormity of that problem of genocide and the ways in which we collectively can engage in inhumanity against each other, I just want to pick out one small piece of that big issue, and that piece that I want to pick out and talk with you about is the question of who is it that does the killing at the front lines of genocide and mass killing. Not necessarily the architects, not necessarily the mid-level bureaucrats, but the rank and file, the people on the front line of mass murder. Who are they? How many people does it take to commit genocide at that scale? Where do these people come from? And in what ways may they be similar to you and I? In many more ways than we think. And in what ways may they be different? Now, to kind of start to set up the stage, those two things we'll do. It's probably important that you know a little bit about my background and what perspective I bring to this topic. Most people who work in the field of Holocaust and genocide studies would be historians, political scientists, the occasional odd sociologist, and even more so, the very occasional and very odd social psychologist. In the field of social psychology, we study basically human relations. How is it that the presence of other people influences how I think, how I feel, and how I behave? This is my 22nd year in the field of social psychology. For whatever reason, and my friends like to speculate on the reasons, but for whatever reason, I've been less interested in normal human relations. So in other words, where many of my colleagues study interpersonal attraction, friendships, how people fall in love, how to get people to fall in love with you, how relationships end, how committees can do better work. They can do the work of 12 actually rather than the work of 6 and loaf in those settings. For whatever reason, again, my interest has been not toward those kind of human relationship contexts, our typical relationship contexts, but more toward human misrelations. What happens when things fall apart? Again, not really between two people in a one-on-one relationship, but between two groups of people. So early on in my work, after graduate school, my major immediate focus was race relations in America. What are the issues of race that America still struggles with, and still a large part of what I do today as a teacher and to some degree as a writer, is to try to understand how is it that groups of people can be torn apart in such ways that I think race remains one of the most divisive issues in America today. Over about the past 10 to 12 years, my research expanded in misrelations to go a bit farther down the continuum and look at issues of genocide. What is it that happens when collective violence becomes so extreme that a group in power, political, social, religious group in power, says there's a group of people living among us that we no longer wish to live, period. So in a way, it falls still along this continuum of human misrelations, but rather than approaching it from the standpoint of a historical context or political context, I approach it from the standpoint of social psychology. Trying to understand, again, in the context of human misrelations, how can it get to the point of genocidal violence, of this type of mass murder? So let's put it in the broadest context we can, and I will start by looking at this, social conflict in human history. Many of you know that a large part of the Jewish and Christian tradition is based in this story that is the very beginning piece, I think, in those traditions of how we understand relationships and misrelationships with each other. Whether you see this story that comes from the Hebrew Scriptures as literal and real, or whether you see it as mythological, a way of understanding human nature, either way, I think it communicates some important truths about human nature. And the story that many of you know is the story of Cain and Abel, the sons of Adam and Eve. Hebrew Scriptures tell us that one day Cain and Abel both made a sacrifice to Yahweh, and for whatever reason, God looks with favor upon Abel's sacrifice, and with disfavor upon Cain's sacrifice. And the Scriptures then go on to say that at some point in the future, Cain falls upon his brother Abel in the field. He kills his brother. Now, I grew up the son of ministers. Both my mother and father were both ministers, and I had heard this story from as long as I've been hearing stories. But it probably wasn't until about 10 years ago that the importance of this story in shaping Western understanding of human relationships really hit home to me. And the importance of that is this, that in this tradition, Hebrew Christian tradition, this is the first time death appears in the world. Two men, says Elie Wiesel, the most widely read writer on the Holocaust, two men, and one of them become a killer. Now understand that death can come into the world any number of ways. Famine, pestilence, plague, accident, the most common way, heart attack. But the first time in these traditions that death enters the world, it does so through murder. And I think that story, again, whether you think it's just a description of how we understand human nature, whether you think it's literally true, I think that story sets us up for a long-standing, long-running, ubiquitous part of the human experience, which is the type of interpersonal conflict that very often will become magnified into intergroup conflict. I think if we jump forward several centuries to give you an idea of some of the status of this, since the Napoleonic Wars, we fought an average of 6 international wars and 6 civil wars per decade. If you look just at the time period since 1900, at what are called high fatality struggles, and by high fatality struggle we mean the loss of lives at least of 1,000 people, we find that since 1900 there have been an average at any point in this time period of 3 high fatality struggles going on someplace in the world in any moment since 1900. So pick any year, pick any month of that year, pick any day of that month, pick any hour of the day, pick any minute of that hour, and the second of that minute. You've got an average of 3 high fatality struggles going on somewhere in the world at that point. 4 decades after the end of World War II saw 150 wars in a 40-year period, and really only 26 days of world peace. That's a little bit actually of a misunderstanding or misnomer, because this doesn't include internal conflicts and civil wars. These just include state-to-state wars in this 4-decade period, and even then we only see 26 days of world peace. Today, actually, more than a third of the world's 193 nations are embroiled in conflict, nearly twice the Cold War level. We are one of those, more than 193 nations in the world that are presently embroiled in conflict. I think there are 2 quotes here that have been helpful for me as I think about, again, this expansiveness of human misrelations throughout history. One of them is a quote from Winston Churchill. He's kind of famous for quotes of all times. But Churchill is quoted as saying, "The story of the human race is war." And that quote is, it's a strong statement. The story of the human race is war. But if you ask historians, as I do with some of my colleagues, if you were to tell the story of the human race in a class, and you said you could only tell it from one perspective, the perspective of religion, of disease, of government, of the rise of the nation state, what if that one perspective was war? How well would that work? And when you stop and think about it, you realize you probably could tell a very accurate and compelling story of the human experience through the lens of war. Because war has obviously shaped our geopolitical boundaries, nation-state boundaries. War has shaped the distribution of language. War has shaped the distribution of culture. War has shaped the distributions of religion. War has even shaped the distributions of diseases throughout human history as well. So I'm not real sure that Churchill is that far off when he says, very boldly, that the story of the human race itself is war. And another quote that's interesting here to me is a quote from Plato, where Plato says, "Only the dead have seen the end of war." And that's a powerful statement when you realize how true it is. That really anyone who's been alive throughout human history has lived at a point in time in history where warfare has been ongoing. And none of us it's very, very unlikely that any of us will ever live for one day in history where we can say, for this one day, there is no war, there is no conflict. So when Plato says that it's only the dead who see the end of war, again, he reminds us of how ubiquitous war is as a part of the human condition and human relations. He also reminds us that a lot of people have come to see the end of war precisely because of warfare. That warfare has led over the past several centuries to an increasing toll in the number of deaths. You see in the 20th century, 100 million deaths attributed to warfare. That's 5 times the amount from the 19th century, 10 times the amount from the 18th century. Sometimes you look at a slide like this, and I think part of your immediate reaction is to say, well, this is all because of technology. We've gotten better at killing people in large numbers and in a relatively short period of time because of advances in weaponry. And to some degree, that's true. But if we could partition out, and we can partition out, the effects of technology on a graph like this, what we would see is that the same steep curve increase would be present here because it's the number of absolute conflicts that have increased over the centuries. In other words, even if we still fought war today, like we fought it in the 1600s and the 1700s, we would still see this very sharp rise in trajectory, indicating a tremendously steep increase in the number of dead because of war and war-related dead as well. So again, it's easy for us to look at this and again, want to sidestep and say it's just about technology, but in truth, it's much more about just the continuing rise and increase in human conflict. And even today, when you hear reports like from the University of British Columbia, the Human Security Report comes out every year, and they'll proclaim that there's been a decrease in warfare the previous year. That's really just, again, a bit misleading because they're talking about decreases in state-to-state warfare. But if you continue to look at war as civil war, as internal struggles, as guerrilla warfare with impoverished nations against stronger nations or even colonizing forces, as genocide as part of warfare, you still see this continuing kind of sharp increase and rise in human conflict. Now, what I'm concerned with is less traditional warfare. In other words, I'm not a military psychologist by any sense. I really don't do work in the psychology of warfare, except as war intersects with genocide. My concern is with genocide. When that line is crossed, and this can be a very fine gray line to be sure, between what you call acceptable military conduct, military combatants, identifiable, legitimate, against other identifiable, legitimate military combatants. Now, many of us would say there still isn't anything acceptable about that, but you understand that at least this is appropriate in terms of how much of the world understands traditional warfare. But there's another side to that line that occurs when a military group engages in warfare, not against another military group, but against innocent civilians, unarmed civilians, who in their mindset they may think of as anything but innocent. But in truth, they're engaging in military-style combat and killing and slaughter against groups of people that are not military combatants in an identifiable way or a legitimate way. When that line is crossed, we've left behind acceptable military conduct in warfare, and we've entered into criminal conduct of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, mass killings. And that is where my interest lies. So let me tell you another way to think about genocide, at least definitionally. Raoul Hilberg is one of probably the most preeminent Holocaust historians. And Hilberg has framed it this way, that very often political, social, religious groups come to power, and they say that there's another group of people living among them that they no longer wish to live among them. And they'll push those people out of the country, or they'll isolate those people in ghettos, because they can't kill them, but they certainly can isolate them or push them out in such a way that they just don't live among them. Well, Hilberg says genocide occurs when you take that statement. There's a group of people living among us that we no longer wish to live among us, and you remove the final two words. And now it becomes, there's a group of people living among us who we no longer wish to live, period. And then when it gets to that point, when a political, social, religious group in power has said, somebody's living among us that we simply no longer wish to live, it has now gotten to the point of genocide. And very often we see this mass killing become a matter, as it did in Nazi Germany, of official government policy. Again, I think often, and you would not fall in this group because the information material you already have is being part of this lecture series, but I think very often lay people tend to think that the story of genocide really began with the Holocaust, and it pretty much ended with the Holocaust. But in truth, the story of genocide, again, goes back pretty much as far as human history goes back. It's going to go back even to the Hebrew Scriptures that we referenced previously. You will find in those Scriptures cases of genocide where people are slaughtering other people in large numbers over an extended period of time because they think that's what God wants them to do. We can find genocide throughout all of human history, but it's the 20th century that genocide really was perfected. Again, in a morally inverted sense of the word, perfected in the sense that we became good at genocide, at killing large numbers of people over an extended period of time. The 20th century started with the destruction of a native Southwest African population called the Guerreros by German colonizing forces in Southwest Africa in 1904. When German colonizing forces came to Southwest Africa, there were about 85,000 Guerreros, native Africans, living in that region. Unlike many other Africans who were impacted by colonization in the 1800s, the Guerrero population actively fought back and resisted the effects and the attempts of the colonizers. And in retaliation, German military forces descended full throttle on the Guerrero population, and out of 85,000, by about 1905, 80,000 approximately are dead. Only about 5,000 left of this population. 1915, 1923, the slaughter of 1.5 million Christian Armenians by an Islamic Turkish regime in Armenia, a genocide that still today is denied as a matter of official government policy by Turkey. And so every year coming up now on April 24th, and you'll have this, I believe, as part of your lecture series, you'll have a commemoration of the Armenian genocide, and it's necessary that you do so, because these are people still trying to convince the world that this happened to them. And again, they're having to respond to a government that, as a matter of official policy, was saying, no, this was never something that we did. These people died as a byproduct of some other wartime-related conditions. The implementation of Soviet man-made famine in Ukraine in 1932 to 1933. Stalin came to the Ukraine. He wanted Ukrainian peasants to buy into his collectivist ideology and economic system. They did not want to do so. So Stalin implemented a man-made famine. He just took all of the harvest of the Ukrainian kulaks in that society. He burnt many of the harvest that he couldn't take with him. And as a result of a famine he made, not nature made, 10 million Ukrainians lost their lives in 1932 and 1933. Now this is important because you get some idea of how long it takes for some of these things to be recognized. It's only 2 months ago that the Ukrainian government passed legislation calling this by its rightful name, genocide. Because for years the Ukrainian government has lived in fear, many years under the Russian system, but only now do they feel that they have the safety and security to call this crime by its rightful name, which was genocide of 10 million Ukrainian peasants in 32 and 33. The Holocaust of 1939 and 1945, as all of you know, the events in which 2 out of every 3 of Europe's Jews, nearly 6 million, lose their lives in a 6-year period. Not an unprecedented act of killing, as we see in the 20th century, but unprecedented in terms of the bureaucracy, the implementation, the technology of it, and in many ways unprecedented in terms of the absolute focus of the Nazi regime to eliminate European Jewry in its entirety. I mean, that type of very focused, official governmental policy of extermination is something that we have not seen to that degree before in history. Again, one of the things often heard after 1945 was the phrase, never again. How many of you have been to the U.S. Holocaust Museum? Okay, you leave the Holocaust Museum, one of the last things you'll see inscripted in the wall is never again. You can go into the bookstore, you can buy those great little rocks that have never again inscribed on them. I don't think they've yet put them on t-shirts, but you find a lot of things there in the bookstore. And if there was truth to it, it would be great. And we could do a series like this, and we could talk about all the ways in which we were cruel and inhumane to each other up until 1945, but we learned the lesson worldwide, and after 45, never again was a reality. In truth, never again has really become ever again. One journalist has said, never again only has meaning if by it you take it to mean never again will Germans kill Jews in Europe in the 1940s. If that's what you mean by never again, it's true. But if you mean never again will we see the face of genocide, that's not true. We've seen it ever again since 1945. Mass killings and genocide in Indonesia, Bangladesh, Burundi, Cambodia, East Timor, Guatemala, Iraq, Rwanda, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and to remind us that the past is still present with us today, ongoing genocides or genocide watches in several other regions of the world as well. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's Committee on Conscience sends out 3 different levels of genocide alerts as part of their mission to try and make never again a reality through education and public knowledge. Today, there are 2 regions of the world presently under genocide watch, which means there's serious potential for genocide and crimes against humanity. One of those regions is Chechnya, which is involved in its second war against Russia, and part of Russia's response to Chechnya is to believe, or to at least act as if, every Chechen civilian is part of the terrorist or guerrilla operations that they're trying to root out of that country. And so Russian activities against Chechen civilians are pretty much going without any compunction whatsoever of making sure that this person is a civilian and this person is actually indeed a terrorist. Chechen civilians are beginning to turn on themselves in some ways in the midst of this struggle as well. But certainly we look at it and we can see that a year from now, where I will be back here, that we could be talking about Chechnya as the next ongoing genocide. Sudan is Africa's largest country, that you've heard a great amount about. Sudan is presently under genocide watch because there is a peace agreement in place between the north and south of Sudan, but it's a very tenuous peace agreement, and for a variety of political, social reasons, it's not a peace agreement that affects the western region of Sudan. So the genocide emergency that we're most concerned with today is Darfur, the western region of Sudan, which is relatively unaffected by this peace agreement between north and south. And the issues in Darfur have become so severe in terms of the Islamic military regime's killers, the Janjaweed, raiding Darfur, looting villages, raping villagers, spoiling villages in such a way that they can never recover, throwing dismembered body parts down village wells so the water will be tainted, in some cases for generations, and then just wiping the entire village to the ground, just burning it, razing it to the ground. That violence has now sprung from Darfur, and it has spilled over into the country, neighboring country to the west of Chad. So it probably is not going to be but a couple of months before the U.S. Holocaust Museum is going to also issue a genocide emergency for Chad as well. Presently, the mortality rate in Darfur is about 10 to 11,000 people per month. So from the time you sit here today, March 20th, looking back at all the things that have happened in your life since February 20th, that same time period in Darfur, 10 to 11,000 people have died as a result of this genocidal violence. If security was to collapse in Darfur, by which we mean if the UN pulled out, which is a possibility, if the African Union peacekeeping forces pulled out, which is always a possibility, the mortality rate in Darfur, the UN estimates, could go as high as 100,000 people per month, dying directly because of genocidal violence or because of disease, malnutrition, hunger, all the things that go under the category of war-related or genocide-related deaths. So again, in many ways, we'd like to say in a series like this that you're talking about a problem whose time has come and passed, but in truth, you're talking about a problem that is still very much with us today, and as I'll mention at the end of the lecture, I'm not convinced it's a problem that's going to go away anytime soon. So it brings me to the second part of our time together, and that is, how does this happen, and who are the people who perpetrate this type of genocide and mass murder? And I apologize, this is kind of actually a horrible slide, PowerPoint. There's just way too many words on it, so we'll try and shorten it down a little bit here. But I think the general principle that struck me is that anytime a regime comes to power, a political, social, religious group comes to power, and they decide they want to commit mass murder on their own citizens, they want to commit genocide, there are a lot of things that they have to worry about to do that. And if you just think of yourself now, if we were a group that comes to power, and we decide there's another group of people, another rival, what's a rival campus of Sonoma State? Chico State. we want to eliminate Chico State. Does everyone a good deal if we did that? Okay, what are the things we have to worry about in that scenario? Well, we have to worry about resistance from Chico State. Okay, maybe they stand up and say, this isn't really in the cards for us, we don't want to be exterminated. We thought for a long time in Holocaust studies that there was no part of Jewish resistance, really very little Jewish resistance to the Holocaust. In truth, there was tremendous Jewish resistance in the Holocaust, scattered throughout many pockets of the extermination process. So resistance from victim groups is real. In Rwanda, when you talk with perpetrators there, they will tell you, the victims did not go easily to their death. They didn't go like sheep to slaughter. They fought back. So if you want to kill another group of people in genocide, you've got to expect that they might fight back. You've got to expect that other people in your community would stand up and say, you can't do this. I mean, other people in California should probably stand up and say, regardless of how you feel about Chico State, we can't let you do this. It's not the right thing to do. Hopefully the rest of the country would stand up and say the same thing with the rest of California. You might have to worry about pressure from the international community. Maybe the world would come here and say, this can't be done. Although in truth, and this is just between you and I, we shouldn't let it leave here, if you want to commit genocide, you can pretty much do whatever you want to do before the world's going to intervene. Before the UN's going to do anything, before the US will come and do anything, before the international community comes to do anything, you pretty much can take care of who you want to take care of to the degree that you'd like to. We've seen it in Rwanda, we've seen it in Bosnia, we see it ongoing today in Darfur. But of all these things you would have to worry about to commit genocide, here's the one thing that strikes me you don't have to worry about. And that is, where do you find the killers? Where do you find people who carry it out? Now, by killers and perpetrators, I'm not talking here about the architects of genocide. I still get this, my poor mother, when she asks what it is I do, and she's studied perpetrators of genocide, and she just doesn't understand it. She enjoys the books. She likes the covers. I don't think she's read what is in them necessarily, that's in her. But she'll say to people when he studies Hitler. I mean, that's her shorthand way of trying to understand what I do. In truth, I have no interest in Hitler whatsoever. And it's not to belittle the role of architects or to minimize their role. Because most people focus on the role of architects. Hitler, Himmler, Goering in the Holocaust, the leaders of the Rwandan genocide, Milosevic in the Bosnian ethnic cleansing and genocide. A lot of attention is focused on those people, but it's just not my attention. I also don't focus on the mid-level bureaucrats, the men and women who make machinery work. Excuse me. In the Holocaust, this would have been someone like Adolf Eichmann, who made sure that the trains got to Auschwitz at the time they were supposed to get to Auschwitz, with the people that were supposed to get to Auschwitz to be dead, likely within a 24-hour window. Again, mid-level bureaucrats are important, like architects are important, but by and large, architects and mid-level bureaucrats have never killed anyone face-to-face. That doesn't make them good people. I mean, they make the policies that lead to the killing, but they don't actually themselves carry out the killing. They have to rely on people at the front lines, like this man at the edge of a pit in Einsatzgruppen group in activity. They have to rely on people at the front lines who they can recruit to do the killing. So you can have all the lunatic architects you want, you could have all the pencil-pushing bureaucrats you want, but if you don't have people at the front line who will kill face-to-face, genocide is not going to happen. And what strikes me as fascinating is that we've never had a genocidal regime stop its genocidal killing because they can't find killers. We've had regimes stop it because of eventual international pressure, because the victim group fought back, as in the case of Rwanda, with rebel forces coming back in to stop the genocide, because other people with conscience in their country said we can't do this. Those things have stopped genocidal regimes. But never has a genocidal regime had to throw its hands up and say, as much as we'd love to kill here, we can't find the people to do it. they can always find enough people to do it. And again, a lot of times we want to sidestep this and say, well, that's because they use the military, and the military has to do what they're told. Many of the genocides from the 20th century, if we went back a slide or two, have very little military involvement. It's paramilitary forces. It's gangs of young children, like we see in Rwanda, roaming the capital streets of Kigali, doing the killing. So I think in many ways we can reduce this slide to just one simple statement. Humans are the weapons of genocide. In other words, I know a lot of times people worry about technology, the development of weapons of mass destruction, biological, chemical warfare. And it's right that we should be concerned about those things. But it's not as if those things do the killing by themselves. Killing happens because some humans are recruited by other humans to kill other humans in large numbers and over an extended period of time. And again, I'd love to live in a world where at nighttime I could go to bed and think, well, genocidal regimes aren't going to have a long life because they can't find killers. But in truth, again, they can find killers. Plenty of killers to do what they want in the context of genocide. So the research questions for me, coming from that general principle, become these two questions. One, how many people does it take to carry out genocide and mass killing? When I teach my course, as I'm doing now at Woodworth on Holocaust and genocide, I think students, by and large, come into the course with the general cultural literacy of knowing that about 6 million Jews were slaughtered in the Holocaust. But if you ask the corresponding question, how many people does it take to kill 6 million Jews? I mean, that's what people haven't thought about. I mean, 6 million is an abstraction. Most of you have never seen 6 million of anything. We just don't know what that looks like. But to ask the question then, how many people does it take to kill 6 million people? That's a difficult question to answer. And again, it's one that most often, excuse me, we haven't really thought that much about. Now again, if you try to answer that question, most of us will say, okay, how many people does it take to kill 6 million? There was Hitler, there was Himmler. But again, we have to stop there and say, no, those are architects. On the front lines, like in this Einsatzgruppen executions photo you see here, how many men, and the occasional women, actually literally bloodied their hands with what one Armenian, U.S. ambassador to Armenia called the hard work of killing? How many people did that? In Armenia, you're talking about people killing with spades, with shovels, with hoes, with whatever farm implement they could get their hands on. In Rwanda, you're talking about people killing with machete, with masu, with clubs studded through with nails. I mean, how many people have to be involved in this type of killing spree? Again, we will never know precisely the answer to this question. Because by and large, if you think of prosecution, who did we go after in Nuremberg? Who are we going after in the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda? Who are we going after in the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia? We go after the architects, some mid-level bureaucrats, some notorious mass murderers. But by and large, the men that you will have seen in this photograph and a previous photograph, we don't know who they are. We don't go after them. We're not sure a society can withstand the prosecution of every single person who committed genocidal crimes. One of the phrases I use in the book is the phrase, genocide overwhelms justice. And what I mean by that is, it's a very real possibility that a society can't heal itself. I mean, it can't reconstitute itself and begin to work again if its judicial system has to find, prosecute, and punish every single person involved in genocide. So by and large, if you want to be involved in the perpetration of genocide and get away with it, your safest bet is to be a rank-and-file killer. Because these are the people who 95% of the time will escape justice in any sense of the word as we understand it. In the Holocaust, our estimates of numbers of rank-and-file killers run as high as 500,000. About 2/3 of those would have been ethnic Germans, Native-born Germans, about a third of those would have been other ethnic nationalities under Nazi-occupied control in the Nazi-occupied territories of the Third Reich. That's about 500,000 people who literally would have bloodied their hands with this hard work killing in the Holocaust. In Rwanda, it's another interesting case study. The genocide in Rwanda took place over a 100-day period, beginning in April of 1994. In that 100-day period, 800,000 Rwandans, mostly Tutsi, some moderate Hutus, were slaughtered by an extremist Tutsi regime and its paramilitary forces, the Interahamwe. 800,000 people in 100 days. I mean, I'm saying a couple things about that. One is Auschwitz, the leading producer of death among the 6 death camps in the Holocaust. You can pick any 100-day period you want to from Auschwitz, and you don't have a rate of death approaching anything near 800,000. So, I mean, this is an incredible, almost orgy of killing and slaughter that happens in Rwanda in a short period of time. Also understand that we can now chart the course of the killings in Rwanda and have a rough idea of the 2 or 3 day period, how many people died, especially in the capital city of Kigali. And we can look at these charts, and what you'll see in them is you'll see a cyclical pattern with killings peaking, then the drop-off, killings peaking again, another drop-off. I asked a friend who was a scholar in Rwanda, why is this the case? Is this because of some intermittent peace activities? Was it rainy weather that kept killers indoors? What is going on here? And his response was to say, no, what is happening is you see the rate at which the killers just simply got tired. They got exhausted from kicking, beating, hacking, clubbing people to death, and they would take a few days off and just drink banana beer to recoup their strength, and then the killing would start again. I mean, that's how much, in terms of work, the killing in Rwanda involved. Very little ammunition, mostly face-to-face, hand-to-hand type of genocide slaughter. So if we ask the question, how many people killed in Rwanda, my same friend who works and lives there, first estimated as many as 1 million perpetrators. When he said that, I thought I'd misheard him, because there were only 800,000 victims. How would you have 1 million perpetrators? And his response was, so much of the killing was done by groups of people, like the picture you see here of the Interahamwe, groups of boys, sometimes as young as 8 years of age, ganging up on 1 or 2 victims and just kicking, beating, hacking, clubbing them to death. And his thought was, maybe you actually had more perpetrators than victims in Rwanda. Now, I don't think that thought has stood the test of time. I think the best estimates in Rwanda are probably between 250 to 300,000 perpetrators, people who actually killed in Rwandan society over the course of that 100-day slaughter. So our second question, I think, is when we look at the numbers of people involved at the rank and file. And again, we can quibble about the numbers, but the general point is, in a non-academic way of saying it, it takes a lot of people to carry out genocidal violence. Okay? So to me, the second question is, who are these people? Where do they come from? How are they enlisted to perpetrate this type of evil? And if what we want to do is think, well, these people are just, they're sadistic beings just waiting to be unleashed, they're full of hate, they've always wanted to be killers, they're lunatics, they're psychopaths, and now the regime just gives them permission to kill. If that's what we think, there aren't that many psychopaths within any society or culture to carry out killing on this large of a scale. And again, I don't mean to be trite about it, but if you have a genocidal regime come to power and say, we want to kill an entire group of people, and to do it, we're just going to use the psychopaths who live in our culture and society to carry that out, you're not talking about enough people to guarantee killing on the scale of the genocidal violence we see here. So to me, the unfortunate recognition is that there are a lot of people involved on the front lines as rank and file killers who are not psychopathic, who have no significant emotional mental disorder, who would be, quote unquote, ordinary people like you and I, who get brought into and who choose to come into this type of genocidal violence. Now, before we talk about kind of my idea of some degree of how that works, I I do want you to understand that certainly other people have asked this same question. I'm not a creative person at all, not really a bright person at all. I'm so surprised I'm up here talking to you about these things. But if I look at it, certainly other people have asked this question, and certainly other people have come up with answers very different from mine. If you read through the book, this is kind of part one of the book where I try to lay out these answers as best I can and also explain why I think they're weak or deficient in some way. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on that today, but I just want to kind of lay out the spectrum for you to say that some people have said it's just the nature of the collective that makes people do bad things. That when groups of people come together, groups are always prone to evil, and anytime a group or a collective comes together, they're capable of this type of tremendous evil. And again, I think that's just a misunderstanding. To me, it's overly simplistic. Sometimes groups come together and they do tremendous good. I mean, you're a part of groups that have done some great things for this university and this community. I don't think it's true or accurate to say that every time a group comes together, it's automatically predisposed to evil. I think groups amplify the tendencies of people within them. And if you bring together a group of nasty people, as a group, they'll be capable of some pretty incredible nastiness. If you bring together a group of good people, and again, many of you are part of these groups, they're also capable of some incredible good. I think other people want to focus just on ideology and say, for instance, as Goldman said about the Holocaust, that the Holocaust happened because Germany hated Jews in a way that no other country hated Jews. I think there are many weaknesses to Goldman's explanation, not the least of which is trying to solve an incredibly complex problem by just pinning it on one specific answer like ideology. I think H.L. Mencken has been quoted as saying, for every complex problem, there's a simple solution, and it's always wrong. And I think many times people have looked at this complex problem of where in the world do all these genocidal killers come from, and they've tried to just find a simple solution of, it's just the collective. It's just ideology. It's just personality. And I don't think we can ever reduce it to just anything. Is ideology important in understanding perpetrator behavior? Absolutely so. Is it the end all to understanding perpetrators? Not at all. I've read through scores of interviews with Holocaust perpetrators and trial documents, and the same thing with Rwandan perpetrators. And it's clear that some of them are very much motivated by the ideology of hatred against Jews or against Tutsi. But it's also clear that about 2 out of every 3 would have a hard time articulating that ideology to you. They don't know what ideology means. It's not what drives them. It's not what pushes them. In Rwanda, the most common thing you will hear from a perpetrator in interviews or in their testimony is, I killed because the radio said I could, and my neighbor had a cow that I wanted, and I could get it by killing it. Or my neighbor had slighted me a while back, and I could get back with them. Or my neighbor had a radio that was better than my radio, and I took it, and in the process I killed them. There's nothing ideological about that. There's certainly an understanding of the other that makes them less than human. But there's nothing just purely ideological that drives that type of genocidal killing. And then finally, people have said, well, certainly it has to be that the perpetrators have pathology, they have a twisted personality. And again, in the book, I devoted an entire chapter to this. It's kind of a long, comprehensive look at it. And to make a long story short, we just haven't found the evidence for any greater rates of pathology among perpetrators than we see in the general population. You could expect in the general population of anywhere, except maybe Chico State, where it'd be higher, that about 10% of people in the population would have some form of pathology. I try to make the argument in the book that you could actually expect for genocidal killers that the rate of pathology would even be lower because psychopaths don't make reliable killers. They don't make reliable anything. And I think in many ways, genocidal regimes actually sort through the recruiting process, in many cases for killers, in such a way that you can expect killers at the front lines of genocide to actually have lower rates of pathology in that population than we see in the general population. So if that's true, then my argument has been to say that it's ordinary people like you and me who commit genocide mass killing. Again, I'm not by any means the first person to ever make this argument. I've tried to develop an understanding of how this is true and why it becomes true, but certainly other people before me have argued against this notion it's ordinary people like you and me who commit this killing. And again, I know that this is a very difficult argument to admit, to understand, to absorb. We don't want to believe this. You know, when I came here, I left my 3 kids behind at home, which it was a happy time when it happened a few days ago. Now I miss them a little bit. We couldn't see them again. But I'd love to tuck them in at night, you know, when I know I'm going to leave the next day, with the understanding that the type of people I study and interview and read about are never the type of people that they will know. They'll never meet anyone like the people I meet through history or I meet now who have done these genocidal massacres, that my kids will never meet anyone like that. But the worst thing they'll have to face is meeting someone from Idaho. But other than that, they'll be safe, they'll be secure, that they'll never know the type of people that I study about. And I understand the comfort in that. And I understand your comfort in wanting to say, oh, it's fascinating to hear about genocidal killers and perpetrators, but they're just very different from any of the people that I'd ever know. But unfortunately, I think the reality is much closer to home, literally. And that is that the great majority of perpetrators of genocidal violence are people very much like you and I, motivated by many of the things that motivate you and I. They can be well educated, they can be people of religious faith, they can be good, kind, caring, cooperative people, but they can also go down a road that makes them capable of producing the types of evil and atrocity that we've been talking about today. I like this quote from T.H. Huxley. Some of you know Huxley as Darwin's bulldog. Charles Darwin, as many of you know, was never very pushy about wanting to publish his theory of evolution, and really only did it when he thought he'd be scooped by another competing scientist in the publication of it. But Darwin wasn't really his own public champion for it. He was pretty hesitant to speak in public for a variety of personal reasons. Just, you know, he wasn't out there about his own theory of evolution. Huxley, though, thought Darwin had solved everything in the world with his theory, and Huxley was very much willing to be the public face that championed Darwin's theory. And Huxley says this in 1860, "My business is to teach my aspirations to conform themselves to fact, not to try and make facts harmonize with my aspirations." What he's trying to say here is that we all have hopes and dreams of how we want the world to work, but it's a mistake to sort through the facts and make those facts fit my hopes and dreams. That really the better approach is to say, as he says in the beginning, to teach my hopes and dreams to conform themselves to fact. To understand the world as it exists, and then structure my hopes and dreams around that. And I think this is an important way of trying to understand and get our minds around the question that brings us together today. And to understand the challenge of what it means to be an educated person, which you're all in the process of becoming. To be an educated person means that you hold truth in esteem. You value truth. And it would be a great world if every truth we found was a truth that made us feel better about ourselves and our place in the world, and it made the world look more beautiful. By the time steal from Al Gore, we know there are some truths that are very inconvenient, that aren't flattering, that don't make us feel good about ourselves, but nonetheless, it's a truth to which we have to respond. And we have to shape our aspirations and hopes around. And I think this is one of those truths. I don't like standing up in front of people and saying, we're all ordinary people, and many of us can be capable of these atrocities. There are a lot of things I'd love to stand up in front of you and say that make you feel good about yourself and make me feel good about myself. But I think the truth of it from studying perpetrator behavior is this, that we do have within us the capabilities of becoming perpetrators of genocide in certain situations, under certain constraints. And to me, it's important that we understand that. Because, and it's not important because I want you to feel badly about yourself and people next to you. But it's important because if we don't understand it, we're not in a position to ever stop it. You know the thing I get tired of hearing the most about Darfur, and I was tired of hearing about Rwanda, and I'll be tired of hearing about it 10, 15 years from now about whatever countries in genocide, is for people to stand back and say, this is just surprising. It's shocking. I can't believe this is happening. How many times does something have to happen in human history for us to no longer be surprised about it? And again, we have this innocent naivete of looking at the images from Darfur and Rwanda and the Holocaust and wanting to say, I just can't believe people would do that. And I think that keeps us on the sideline. I mean, I want to embrace to some degree the reality that says people do this, and they do it often, way too often. So when we see it happening in Darfur, I don't want a moment's hesitation because the world is sitting there going, God, I can't believe this is happening. Believe it. It happens. It happens throughout human history, and it happens relatively easily. And if we understand those facts, our aspirations become formed by it. I'm not by nature a pessimist. Okay? I don't do these lectures because I'm pessimistic and I don't bring you into that pessimism. I want a basis in reality that says our aspirations and hopes of ending genocide have to be informed by the fact that most people who commit genocide are quote-unquote ordinary people, very much like you and I. And if we start there, I think it's what gives us hope in wanting to understand the unmaking of genocidal killers. And if we know how they're made and how they're grown, we know how to unmake them. We know how to ungrow them. And to me, that's the important piece of the process. So what I've tried to do, and I'm hesitant to spend a lot of time on this because I'm aware that many of you have the first edition of the book. The second edition of the book just came out about 2 weeks ago, I think today almost. And I've had a hard time getting copies for myself of that book, which is a little odd. Actually, several of you seem to have copies. I'd like to talk to you afterwards to figure out how you got them, because I've been yet not terribly successful in doing that. But a large part of the second edition of the book is to take the model from the first edition of how ordinary people become killers in genocide, and to tweak it a bit because of responses to the first edition from scholars and colleagues around the world who read the first edition and said, we like these things are unclear, what about this, what about this? The field of Holocaust studies changes tremendously every year as increasing amounts of archives from the Holocaust get translated, we release them to the general public and academics who work on it. So as I said in the first edition, I certainly considered the model to be a work in progress. And so this is why I'm looking at the second edition. We're trying to understand, again, the role of culture in shaping society that's capable of producing perpetrators. I don't believe that culture makes a society of perpetrators, but I think culture can make a society that's capable of producing perpetrators. I think collectivistic, authoritarian, social dominance values of societies are important. I look at Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia and Herzegovina, which now take increasing amounts of my attention. And I see there are societies very similar to Germany that have strong patriarchal, linear structures of society. In Cambodia, it is part of the system and the code of honor that you don't question authority. And the notion of, is the authority legitimate? Did they receive their power legitimately? Are they making legitimate demands? Those questions aren't of interest. The question of interest is, are they the authority? If they are the authority, part of the cultural code is, we obey that authority. It's not excuse-making, and again, it sounds a bit overly simplistic, but I certainly do think that certain types of cultures can foster a society that's capable of producing perpetrators. Secondly, I've been very interested from the very beginning in how is it that we define the other in such a way that they can be dehumanized, become less than human, so they can be killed fairly easily. I think when I lectured about the first edition of the book over the past few years, one of the common questions was, what piece of it do you think is most important in making a perpetrator? And I think it's really this piece of dehumanizing the other is incredibly important for me. I think this hit me about 10 years ago, 8 to 10 years ago. I was in the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., reading through perpetrator testimony where a perpetrator is being asked by a prosecutor, what made you think, or how did you come to think that it was right to kill Jews? And you have this incredible response from the perpetrator, and I think all the more so incredible because I don't think he was trying to protect himself in any ways. He was just being perfectly honest, and he said, in effect, I never thought it was right to kill the Jews, but I knew it was wrong to not kill them. I mean, that's a completely different way of understanding the other. It's not just right to kill them, that's not the issue, but it's actually wrong if you don't kill them. I mean, that's how far outside our universe and moral commitment the victim falls. It's not only okay to kill them, but if you don't kill them, you're actually doing something wrong. I think of this also when I think about testimony from American cavalry personnel in westward expansion in the 1800s as they would run across, many times literally, American Indians on their way in this expansion. And some of the ways in which, again, they dehumanized Indians to such a degree that they desecrated their bodies in ways that we thought, you could never do this to someone that you thought of as part of the human community. You can only do this to someone that you think is no longer part of the human community. You can only sever the testicles of an Indian male that you slaughtered and empty them and sew them together to use as a tobacco pouch if that person is no longer part of the human community. You cannot excise the vagina of a woman that you killed and probably raped beforehand and take the vagina and stick it on your saddle horn as a trophy piece if you think of that person as part of the human community. So to me it's essential to understanding, and this is the scary part, to step in the shoes of the perpetrator and ask the question, how does the perpetrator view his or her victims? And to realize as you step into their shoes that their victims are so far outside the bounds of human commitment and obligation that it's actually wrong if you don't kill them. And then thirdly, to look at the issue of how genocide killing happens. It doesn't happen by people who do it alone. It most often happens by people who work in groups. And what is it about groups that socialize and teach people how to kill? Again, this is where I differ very much from Daniel Goldhager's work, who makes it sound as if as soon as many Germans were given permission to kill Jews, they jumped into it, they enjoyed it, and they did it very well and very effectively. I think most accounts of perpetrator behavior give us a picture of someone at the beginning who is nauseous, who vomits, who has hallucinations, who has to do his or her atrocities drunk. In many cases, we see it in Rwanda, we saw it in Bosnia, we see it with the untouched group in the Holocaust, but who over time becomes socialized into a process of brutalization in which they start to become creative with their destruction and their means of killing. And the more creative one can be in killing and inflicting pain, it's almost like a badge of honor that you wear in this context of cruelty. And the things that bind people together, you feel these. You've been part of groups where conformity and peer pressure has maybe made you do some things or say some things that you might not otherwise do. Those same dynamics, I argue, work in perpetrator behavior. A perpetrator sets the edge of the ditch. He's a member of the untouched Goodman. He's got 2 feet away from him, a victim, Eastern European Jew, kneeling on the edge of the ditch. Are the issues of conformity and peer pressure important in understanding why he eventually chooses to shoot and kill that first victim? Absolutely, positively important. And so I think it works in connection with these other 3 pieces to again give us some understanding of how perpetrators are made. And then finally, why is this issue important? I think it's important because the age of genocide is not over. Again, I don't mean to sound overly pessimistic about it, but I do want to be realistic about it. And I think the realism is that with population growth continuing to just expand exponentially, and especially in some conflict-ridden continents like Africa, we recognize that with this growth in population, there's going to be a corresponding competition for resources that are very scarce. Today in Africa, which is the most conflict-ridden continent in the world, 7 out of 10 conflicts in Africa are over the scarcity of what? It's the scarcity of water. things that I've seen many of you drinking during the context of this lecture. Okay? If we can't somehow make water more available as a resource to that continent, we can certainly expect a number of in-group conflicts to increase. Now, is this a cause of genocide? No. But because genocide occurs in the context of war and conflict, the more conflicts you have popping up around the globe, the greater chance that a few of those will flame up and actually become genocidal conflicts. Where a group in power says, we're just tired of fighting this other group, and we've got enough power on our side to just wipe them out entirely. And they may very well do so. Secondly, I want you to hear me very much when I say that, one of the things that I worry about often with my work is that people will read it or misread it as an attempt to excuse the behavior of perpetrators. That is not the intent whatsoever. I just think we have to explain it. We have to make it comprehensible because, as I said earlier, if we don't understand how perpetrators are made, we have no hope of understanding how to unmake them, how to undo them to some degree. And I think that's very important. Just because something becomes comprehensible to us doesn't make it any less reprehensible. What the perpetrators did and how they did it, they bear full moral, legal, spiritual accountability and responsibility for. No model or explanation is ever going to take that away. But I don't want to make the mistake of saying what perpetrators do is so atrocious that all you can do is step back and run away from it and say, I don't want to study it because I don't want to be tainted with what my eyes will have to see in studying perpetrator behavior. Because again, to me, we can't unmake this. We can't stop it if we don't understand the things that have made it. And in understanding the things that make perpetrators, that doesn't make them any less responsible by even a smidgen for the behaviors and the atrocities that they've committed. Finally, as most of you know, this book was first published in 2002 as Cain and Abel. The new book is out now a couple weeks ago, second edition, Cain and Abel. The new book, if you're interested and you've read the old one, part one is relatively the same, some changes, small changes here or there. But I'd say part two of the book is probably about 2/3 new from what was in part one. The sources, the updated information, again, because of the pace of Holocaust studies and genocide studies scholarship, I think about 2/3 of the sources we use throughout the book are also updated and current as well. So, I want to take a few minutes to answer any questions or hear any comments that you might have in regard to either what you've read or what you've heard today. Yes?
I'm just curious, after the period of genocide is over and the countries like after, what is the interaction between those parties who were killing the other side of the population? How is that?
That's a great question. The after effects of genocide, what does it look like? Now, this is an important question because it's a post-Holocaust question. Okay? After the Holocaust, perpetrators and victims, by and large, never had to live together again. Jews who were still alive, a minority in Europe, fled Nazi-occupied Europe. They came in large numbers to three places: the U.S., Canada, and then in largest numbers to the state of Israel once it was established. So Jews, after the Holocaust, never really had to deal with this issue of how do you live together again in physical proximity with the people that tried to kill you. Because by and large, Jews haven't returned to those areas of Nazi-occupied Europe where the destruction of the Holocaust happened. Now that is not true in Bosnia, in East Timor, in Guatemala, in Rwanda, and it won't be true in Darfur. In those countries, and to me this is what makes the issue of reconciliation and healing just incredibly complex and fascinating. In Rwanda, you have Hutu and Tutsi who never lived segregated neighborhoods in the first place, now living literally next door to each other. You could have a Tutsi family in many rural parts of Rwanda living, again, literally next door to a Hutu family that if they didn't try to slaughter them in the genocide, probably didn't help them, didn't hide them, didn't support them in any way. And what we're faced with now in post-Holocaust genocide studies is this important question that you asked. How in the world does Rwanda start to heal itself when the perpetrators and victims have to live together? And unfortunately, and I hate to keep being down, I think we could end with something pleasant I can tell you, but the unfortunate thing about Rwanda is, how many saw what's on Rwanda? Okay, great story, Paul Rusesabagina. The movie ends, the rebel forces come back in, they beat the Hutu government down, and all things are good. Rwanda is worse off today in terms of potential for violence and conflict than it was in 1993 before the genocide started. Perpetrators and victims have changed roles. The minority Tutsi is in government, they're in power, they're suspicious of the Hutu, and they'd like to eliminate the Hutu in some form or the other. We have 6 risk factors that we look at to see if the country is high at risk for genocide. Rwanda is high on 5 of the 6 risk factors. I mean, there's a very good chance that by the next time the next class has this lecture series, that we could be talking again about genocide in Rwanda. Why? Because we haven't been able to answer this question: how do perpetrators and victims come back to live side by side? And Rwanda's had a hard time answering it because they don't know, do we prosecute all the perpetrators? Do they go through the court system in Tanzania? Do we do it in Rwanda? Do we do it in these local panels called Kasha panels, which means literally justice on the grass? I mean, Rwanda's trying to struggle with what this type of reconciliation looks like. So I think if you're interested in genocide studies as an occupation, but you want something hopeful that you can work toward and make the world a better place, that's exactly it. We've got to figure out what types of structures and systems we put in place that allow perpetrators and victims to literally live side by side again after the slaughter has happened. Because in most areas of the world subject to genocidal violence today, victims aren't going to have the options Jews had of immigrating elsewhere. They won't have the skills in many cases, they won't have certain language capabilities, they won't have the economic strength to do so, and they're not going to have a new state created for them to immigrate into in the ways that Jews had that opportunity after the Holocaust. So genocidal reconciliation, peace and healing, I think is going to be, to me, is the most important thing people in the field are trying to understand. Yes?
Towards the beginning of the lecture, you said that there was 3 kind of genocide watch categories. I only caught 2 of them. Could you go over those again?
Yeah, I just mentioned the 2 here: genocide emergency, which is the most severe. A genocide is ongoing. Genocide watch, which means there's potential for genocide and crimes against humanity. And the first one has changed a couple times. I believe it's just genocide alert. Do you know? I think the basic one is just genocide alert, which is the lowest level that the U.S. Holocaust Museum has.
How do they decide? Like, do they decide quickly that there's an alert? How many does that mean? A certain number of deaths? Or?
It really isn't related to number of deaths. I think there are a lot of, I'm referring here to 6 risk factors. Barbara Harf is a researcher at the U.S. Naval Academy who has said there are 6 things you can look at. For instance, type of political governance, prior genocide, human rights abuses, and you can actually, she's tried to scale and score societies in those 6 categories to try and get an estimate of how likely genocide is to occur here in the near future. But the key part of your question is how quickly. And that's what the international community doesn't do well, is we don't do anything quickly in response to genocide. And this is important because to delay a couple of weeks in genocide like in Rwanda, because of a shipping manifest mistake in a warehouse in Baltimore, some important armored personnel carriers did not get to Rwanda in the time they should have. They got there 2 weeks later. You and I, 2-week delay, you get a card from your computer manufacturer saying, here's how to be there for 2 weeks, you live through it, it'll be fine. In Rwanda, a 2-week delay in a killing spree that's only 100 days long, you measure that 2 weeks in the loss of a few thousand lives. And for the UN or for the US or for the world to take its time responding to genocide, you just measure that life after life after life. And the fact that we can't do things quickly or choose not to do things quickly there, I think is the greatest sin that we carry on us.
Yes. If I don't know how you mentioned South Africa, and I'm wondering how that fits into your categories, of genocide, or, but if it does, how do you view their system of reconciliation, the Reconciliation Commission, as perhaps a kind of model for other situations?
It's a good question. Two questions, yes.
I don't know whether everybody heard.
Okay, great.
Question.
Two questions you raised, both of which are great questions. First is, where does South Africa fit in our understanding of genocide and what genocide is or isn't? And this is a very odd academic discussion, but by the UN definition, genocide just occurs in the persecution and the attempted elimination of an ethnic, national, racial, or religious group. Political groups aren't included in that, and so that leaves a lot of things out that we might think are genocide, but we have to give kind of another category to, and the category that's often we get into that is mass killing. South Africa was an apartheid regime that certainly never seemed to focus as a regime on the elimination of a group of people. It focused very much and with great effectiveness on the disempowerment, the disenfranchisement of the people, and really in many ways the enslavement of the people. Those are horrible things. They're human rights abuses. They don't typically fit under the context of what we call genocide. Now, the second question is a key one. In South Africa, there's been some healing because of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Is that a great model in terms of reconciliation and healing in genocidal societies? I'd say probably three things in response to that. One is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is one of 24 reconciliation commissions that have been in place somewhere in the world since 1974. It's drawn a tremendous amount of attention, not as much because of its effectiveness, I think, as much as it has because of its tie to Bishop Tutu. An incredible man, and I think the force of his personality has drawn attention to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But I guess, want you to hear that it's one of 24 other ones in pretty recent history that have been somewhat effective. I think the second thing is that when you talk to people in South Africa, and I have colleagues who lead study programs in South Africa, it's worked well to some degree, but it hasn't worked as well as the world thinks it's worked. In other words, it's helped in healing, it's helped in reconciliation, but the TRC has had the same problems, its own loopholes, that many South Africans feel that they've been cheated out of justice in some way. So I always want to be careful about saying, is this as great as we hear it is? I think it probably is one of the most effective reconciliation commissions in recent human history, but it certainly isn't perfect in any sense. And I think the third thing that your question raises for me is a question of how does this work as a model? And that's an important one, because even if it's been very effective, is it a great model for how reconciliation ought to be done elsewhere? And let me put it in a couple of contexts that I'm most familiar with. Rwanda is one. When Rwanda starts to heal from genocide, people in Rwanda immediately, I mean, it makes sense. It's the same continent. They look south to Africa, South Africa, and say, oh, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, let's bring that up to Rwanda, and let's make it work for us the way it worked for them. But it didn't work that way in Rwanda. It was different enough culturally that it just didn't have the same impact in Rwanda that it had in South Africa. And Rwanda fairly quickly, in 1996, early 1997, Rwanda basically said, well, Truth and Reconciliation Commission worked well there, but it's not going to work that same way for us. The other place I'm familiar with is a place I visit and take students to every other year to study peace and conflict, and it's Northern Ireland. And Northern Ireland has, since the end of the Troubles, whenever you want to date that, Northern Ireland has tried to struggle with the same issue. They still struggle with it today. They have until next Monday to fix it. But the issue has been, how do we heal? How do we reconcile? And trust me when I say that Northern Ireland has tried every single thing in the world that's been tried to find reconciliation. And to me, the great lesson again was, while the TRC may have worked well in South Africa, it just doesn't translate immediately well and perfectly well to other cultural settings. And I think the international community has finally learned this. They recognize there's not one size fits all in terms of reconciliation, that different cultural dynamics, different origins of the conflict, different understandings of conflict, all of them necessitate really case-by-case-by-case approaches. And that's why I said in response to the first question, if you're interested in the field, I think the issue of reconciliation is a place to go because every place is going to be different. And to me, there can be nothing more exciting than trying to understand how we bring back together a society that has torn itself apart. Do we have time for another question?
We have time for one more.
Time for one more question. One more good one. Not to put pressure on it, but just like a great, insightful question. Oh, now everybody's scared.
Okay, I guess you've
Good.
said
Well, thank you very much.